So I thought we'd start off talking a little bit about kind of our terms and kind of defining what consciousness means. And in preparation for tonight, I've obviously been kind of reading about what the various scientists in the field say about consciousness. And you read some criticism of people saying that the term is almost too vague. Certainly, we're the Empiricist League. If we talk about empiricism and measuring, how do we actually define consciousness in a way that's useful as a scientific term? And maybe Heather, if you could start from a neuroscience perspective, how do you think about what does it mean in a way that we can make sense of it?
Yeah, so it's funny because I was once giving this lecture at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I taught a course there on consciousness, and the style is there's a lot of interaction with the audience the people I was lecturing to in the classroom, and there was a bunch of professors there, and I just had that very first slide, and just saying, okay, we're trying to understand the neural basis of consciousness, and literally they started asking me questions about the definition and whatever. And so it ended up for an hour. I was stuck on the first slide. I couldn't get to any of the stuff because we got into this whole debate about how do you define it. So I ended up actually getting invited to this meeting in Aspen where it was a small meeting, but they invited some of the top philosophers and neuroscientists and psychologists, and for a week of discussion. And the whole task was to, at the end of this week, to come up with a definition of consciousness we can all agree on. So it was fascinating. We had, the whiteboards, and we were going all over. And finally, at the end, what we all agreed on is very simple definition, that it's simply just first-person subjective experience. And that's what it is we're trying to understand.
Great. I guess similar question to George. When you think about physics and you think about the physical sciences, and you're studying the physical world, consciousness can be thought of as something almost immaterial in some people's minds. I mean, how do you confront that same problem in your discipline?
Well, I really have to defer to the domain expert for the definition of consciousness. I would add, though, I'm sure you would agree, that when people use the word consciousness, it's like using the word cancer. It actually means a variety of ideas that kind of get shoved under a single word. So there's the phenomenal consciousness you were talking about, but sometimes the word also means to be conscious of something, so to have access to that information. And probably from a physicist's point of view, that's the more important one. Mm-hmm. The consciousness means it's registered in a measuring or an observing system.
Well, just to break it apart a little more, there are, because yes, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but we can break it down into states of wakefulness. So you can talk about state of consciousness. Are you in a coma? Are you in a deep sleep? Are you on certain types of drugs? How is that affecting your state of consciousness? But the other thing is, when you look at wakefulness, so let's say you have a perfectly healthy, fully awake brain, fully conscious, so to speak, then it's about awareness. What are you particularly aware of? And that's the kind of stuff I talked about. So you're having a fully healthy brain that's not on drugs, it's well fed, there's no brain damage, whatever, and then the question of whether you see something presented to you or not, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. So that's how we can kind of break it down in these two domains, wakefulness and awareness.
So, John, kind of thinking about your background and some things that you've gone through in your life, you mentioned briefly during your presentation that you studied to be a Christian minister at one point in your life. And I'm wondering, again, we're empiricists here. Many of us maybe might tend to kind of a radical materialist view of consciousness. I'm wondering, based on your background, when you think about your fellow panelists here and how they think about consciousness, what's your reaction? Is this something that we can measure in a way that's useful? From a scientific perspective?
The first thing I think of is dolphin sex. I'm just kidding. Is that your slide? Well, the thing about my faith for me is I went to college. I was in a secular high school, and I was the freaky Christian kid that tried to evangelize people. And then I went to an extremely conservative Christian college where I was the freak progressive. So I had those experiences. But in both places, what I learned, and by the way, this is certainly not anything in the domain of Christianity or Buddhism or atheism, meaning when you see someone who lives what they say they are trying to believe, to me it's very powerful. And in my case, both my parents, when I was 9, we went to a Methodist church, and it was a good community. I always joke about Methodists, it's really about Jell-O. It's like, how much can you put in Jell-O? Like, there's carrots, and now there's peas, and there's marshmallows. We're good Christians. Like Paul talked about Jell-O. Anyway, for me, what I saw is my dad, who wasn't like an angry guy, like violent, but he was angry. And when they accepted Christ, I actually saw their demeanor change, their character change. And it was every day in the house. You know, it wasn't subtle. And for me, so an empiricist side of observation, what's always interesting is like my faith has never just been sort of like a blind just because of cultural stuff. And in college, I studied a lot of scripture in terms of New Testament, the Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek texts. And there's a lot of historical aspects to those documents, first century codexes and all that. So I've never been someone, I don't want to believe in something that I can't test through empirical knowledge, A, but then B, the experience of a constant revisiting of that consciousness, as it were, of the faith keeps coming back.
I think that's a great segue to the next set of questions that I wanted to ask, which was around kind of the mind-body problem. So going back millennia, philosophers and now scientists have been debating this question of the mind versus the body. Is the mind something that is separate, kind of a soul, or can it be totally explained through physical processes? And I guess, again, maybe we'll start with you, Heather, in your experience as a neuroscientist. When you think about the brain and consciousness, do you think, from what you've seen, that consciousness can be fully explained by processes in the brain and the neurons firing, and is that sufficient to explain what we experience as consciousness in your view?
Yeah, so initially when I began studying the brain to try to understand this problem, I was looking for something else. I wanted there to be like evidence for something more than the brain, right? Like a soul or something that can exist after my brain doesn't exist anymore, really. It was my fear of death that kind of sparked my interest. And there's nothing that we can, at least from an evidence base, from science, that we can see that there's something else besides the neural processes. They're intimately connected. And so if, I work with a lot of patients who have brain damage or lesions or whatever, and you think you're this person and I have this personality, but if I knock out certain parts of your brain, you're going to completely change. And so it really is tied to brain function and consciousness as well. I mean, we can knock out very particular parts of the brain and you're no longer going to have experience. So we know it's intimately tied to the brain. The question is just how exactly. But I don't think there's any other, at least there's no evidence for any immaterial, soul or whatnot. Now, I did have this meeting, this was actually at the House of Lords in England, where they brought together religious leaders with neuroscientists who are studying consciousness to ask the question of, well, if we understand the neural correlates of consciousness, will that explain away the soul? And we had a bunch of debates, and basically what the religious leaders had said is that no, because the soul is this thing that it can't be touched by science. Like it's not, and it kind of, then there became no more question, because once you can't say whether it's there or not with, using experiments, then there's nothing else to say, really. It's just a matter of faith, right? But as far as from a scientific point of view, there's no evidence for any immaterial soul other than whatever processes the brain are creating consciousness, and how it works is complex, but not something that is that we'll never be able to understand.
So I guess I ask you, John, what your reaction to that is. I know the famous atheist scientist Daniel Dennett goes so far as to say that consciousness is like a total illusion, in the same way that we almost perceive the world as being flat in some sense. That's just an illusion of the way our senses perceive the world. And once we got more information, we realized that was not the way the world is. He believes the same thing about consciousness. It's just a total illusion. And I'm wondering, kind of what your reaction is to that and some of the things that Heather said. I mean, what's your take on it?
Well, thank you, because that was really interesting. I'm a huge fan. I mean, there's like C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite people, because he was a total skeptic, for instance, and he was a Christian, but he set out to disprove aspects of Christianity. He thought it was total bullshit, just complete bullshit, was angry about it. It wasn't just like a sort of like, you believe what you want. He was like, no, that's bullshit. And he went out, and the more he, from his mindset, and at the time, quasi or scientist, he empirically for himself sort of self-converted. Now, again, that happens for any religion, or it can happen also a person saying, I don't believe. I think for me, sort of proving a soul, and again, I totally defer to Heather here in terms of your expertise. There's two sides to it. One is I wouldn't know how a bunch of people in a room wouldn't necessarily be able to say, look, there's a soul. And I'm not mocking. I mean, I just don't know. It's sort of like trying to prove the resurrection of Christ or anything sort of transformational and miraculous. You can, in historical terms, like with a resurrection, you can say a lot of things. Like Christians up until 400 were crucified upside down and killed, and their friends were killed mercilessly. Why would they believe in something they knew was a lie? That to me is it's not necessarily empirical, like testing, like taking a vial of liquid and testing it. But from a sense of like common sense, that seems empirically like a pretty strong argument. If we have time, I can tell you a story about another spiritual thing, but initially that's at least my initial thought.
And George, I guess similar question to you. I mean, in terms of looking at this from a perspective of physics, do you think the framework of physics could potentially be sufficient to explain and understand consciousness, or will we always need some other kind of model?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a presumption of our science that it will be sufficient. And if it's not, then we'll just hack on some new ingredient to make it sufficient. But the point is, and that's not going to be an arbitrary new ingredient. I don't want to be facetious. It will be a new ingredient that's motivated by the science, and then somehow fits into a larger framework of science. So I think at least from the scientific perspective in both neuroscience and physics and the other domains that study this scientifically, dualism is kind of, we don't need to resort to a mind-matter dualism. That said, you do get another kind of weak dualism coming in here in a couple ways. One would be that the consciousness isn't in the atoms, it isn't in the kind of the stuff you can kick, it's in the way the atoms are put together. So it's kind of beyond matter in that sense, or it's a different component or a different perspective on matter. It's the way the matter is organized. And then Dave Chalmers actually argues for more of a full-blooded dualism, where you actually do have a problem understanding subjective experience at all. Because once you exhaust the methods of science to put together all the brain areas, you still are left wondering, well, why does red feel like red or look like red? Why does soft feel like soft?
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. We'll ask maybe 2 or 3 questions, then we'll get some more the panelists going again. So yes, right here.
Hi, Heather, you mentioned the word experience, so let me ask you a question. When you're having a dream and it's a nightmare, you're experiencing all these emotions. So is that consciousness?
So the question, just to repeat it for anyone that couldn't hear, would you describe the emotions you experience in dreams and nightmares as consciousness?
Yeah, dreams that you are aware in or aware of or remember, they're conscious experiences. So that's why I said before, we define consciousness as we describe it as, what you experience from the moment you wake up and you're aware of things till you go back into a deep dreamless sleep. Because when you're dreaming, that's another state of consciousness. And we actually can look at the brain during dreams, and it looks different. Certain parts of the thalamus are active that we know correlate with conscious perception. And so when you are dreaming, we can map that out in the brain and see when a person is likely to be conscious and experiencing things during sleep. So those are conscious states. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
So really great discussion. Appreciate it. Got a lot of questions, but I'm going to keep it very brief. So I'm really interested in consciousness, because my simple definition is awareness, right? Being aware of things that you weren't previously aware of. I'm really interested in the link between consciousness and society. I feel like a lot of our technology is making us more conscious about a lot of things that we weren't conscious about before. I'm thinking about social networks as sort of digital networks of consciousness. And I'm really curious about how that's going to shape society in the future. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. Are we even prepared to deal with the onslaught of awareness that we are getting now and will get in the future? Any thoughts?
So the question is around the idea of consciousness and awareness and how it is evolving with all of our technology and social networks and so forth.
Affecting society.
And how is it affecting society? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, my last 2 books touch a lot on this in terms of self-awareness and introspection. First of all, might sound negative, it's not intended to. There's a lot of studies about Facebook and stuff. You can get very addicted to it, and It doesn't, again, it's not to demonize Facebook or technology, but yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, by design, and again, I used to work in marketing. I was an EVP of a top 10 PR firm, so I know that the logic is, how do you keep eyeballs glued here? And the question of, is it evil? Evil's kind of a stupid, vague word, but the sense of, like, is that what we want, either for yourself or for your loved ones? And so a lot of the stuff about AI that I focus on is this sense of, especially emotional awareness, because sort of a joke in the community. It's not really a joke, I guess, but the more that we kind of bring robots into our life, the more we might become like robots, right? In the sense of we are kind of always on our screen. So I think the short answer for me is that it's utterly prevalent. It's a paradigm shift, and a lot of people will say, like, well, it was the same way with radio and TV and Marshall McLuhan and all that, and I totally agree on one spectrum. I think the thing that's a game changer for me is virtual and mixed reality. I've been studying mixed reality augmented reality for about the past 5 years. And even Pokemon Go over the last weekend, when you start to hold up a screen and you see digital data over the screen, I hear you laughing, which I understand. But I think it was, 20% of all Android users downloaded it within a weekend. And I've been writing about this in Mashable for years. That's just the first big thing. When you wear the glasses over your eyes and over your ears, what people will do, this is not a joke, it's going to happen, is you go, I don't like looking at Republicans. Fucking hate Republicans. So Pokemon Go is going to be, if you're Republican in any shape, or I can scan Twitter and I know through your sentiment you're a Republican, I like Trump, then I'm just going to see you like as a bush. And I'm going to fucking ignore you. Right? And I've been writing about this for years. And I'm glad you're laughing, but I have kids. And bias, by the way, bias is a whole other discussion in terms of technology and bias, how things like race. There's this famous thing with a young black guy who's looking at an HP piece of technology. It's got facial recognition technology. It's a very funny video. It's very sad. But he's also like, hey, HP, check it out. Camera doesn't move. Your facial recognition technology is obviously for white people. And then a white woman pokes her head in and you see the screen go whoop, whoop, whoop. So if you want, even that's a whole other conversation, bias in technology, or if you're handicapped, the bias about technology, it's so immersive. And the whole programmer culture and stuff in Silicon Valley, it's utterly immersive. But anyway, great question, and I could go on for hours. Or 2 books.
Let's take one more question right now, and then we'll ask some others. Is there a question back there? I can't. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering, for any of the panelists who want to answer, to what extent do you think that the computer or computing system is an apt versus a misleading or inappropriate analogy for the brain function in general and consciousness in particular?
So the question is, to what degree can we think of applications as a good analogy for the brain and consciousness?
It used to be like cognitive psychology, and brought into this idea that the computer is like the hardware of the brain, and the mind is like the software, I guess. So it would be akin to like apps and things like that. And it's an interesting analogy, but as I was sort of saying, is that if you simulate these things in a computer, I mean, even if you can simulate a computer that a program that will talk back to you and act as pass the Turing test, and even we talk about AI. I mean, they're already way more intelligent than us in certain things. Like doing complex mathematical calculations, they can do it way better than we can. There are many things, but whether it will have subjective experience is the question I care about. And so although these analogies are interesting to think about, the real question is, will that computer program have subjective experience? Will it actually feel feelings? Because that'll bring in a whole world of ethical things. Then we have to treat them a certain way if they can actually feel pain, let's say. When we talk about consciousness, you don't need language, you don't need self-awareness. It's just raw, basic sensation. Seeing the color red, feeling pain. You don't need to be able to describe it. We talk about that's first order consciousness, second order is describing it, third order is thoughts about other thoughts. We don't need any of that. It's just, but if these programs can feel, then we have to treat them differently. Then we can't just unplug the computer and throw it out. But I think from what we're understanding about the brain and theories of consciousness have gleaned is that we don't think that they can or will be able to actually feel, even though they'll act, and we'll attribute them with all sorts of human characteristics because that's what we do, because that's the way the brain interacts with the world, doesn't mean that they'll actually have those characteristics.
So a question I wanted to ask you, George, I think you touched upon it just for a moment, and that's the kind of, I've read some of your work around kind of quantum mechanics, and you read some things out there about people thinking about quantum mechanics as potentially having some explanatory model for consciousness. I'm wondering if you've come across that, what your take on it is, what role that might have to play in solving this hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, this alludes to some of Roger Penrose's work, and I went to some of the talks he gave around The Emperor's New Mind when he published that book back in the early 90s, and it was exhilarating seeing physicists of his caliber struggle with the question of consciousness, and he thought that the non-algorithmic or the non-computable character that he thought consciousness has might be associated with quantum mechanics. And I think it would be fair to say that that's a minority view, or really even a marginal view now, that the brain does seem to be a classical computer in that context. It doesn't require quantum physics. We do see quantum physics in some biological systems, one example being photosynthesis. It actually seems to be required in photosynthesis, quantum coherence, to handle some of the energy transfer within chlorophyll, but not within the brain. So I don't think we need to appeal to that. And for a lot of people, of course, the appeal was, well, we got one mystery and we got another mystery, therefore they're the same mystery. Conservation of mystery. So I think, no, we don't, unfortunately, we can't conserve mysteries. We've got a mystery of physics, we've got a mystery of consciousness, and we're going to have to deal with both of them.
Here's another big one for you guys. What about free will? So if the brain, or if consciousness can be reduced to material processes in the brain, what does that mean for free will? Heather, you were our guest, I think about a year and a half ago. You did a whole presentation on free will. It's a tough subject, but what's your take?
There's a lot. Okay, free will in 2 minutes. The basic answer is that it depends on how you define free will, okay? But if you're talking about the classic kind of free will in the Cartesian sense, is like, basically, if everything in my brain was exactly the same, every neuron firing was exactly the same, every neurochemical slushing around, as when I made one decision, let's say I decided to drink the Coke over the Pepsi, okay? Now, free will, true free will in that sense would say that if everything was exactly the same, everything in the environment, the air temperature, what I ate for breakfast, every neuron firing was the same, I could have chosen otherwise. And as far as we know, that there's no something else that it can like supersede what's happening. And in terms of experiments in neuroscience, there's a classic Libet experiment in the 1980s, started out this idea that basically he looked at brain activation, and you could lift your finger at will whenever you felt the urge to do it. You just had to remember where on this clock this sort of second hand was when you had the urge to make the movement. Not even because there was a time delay between when you're willing it and actually physically moving, right? Just remember where you were when you had the intention. And what he found is that preceding that moment of your intent to move or make that decision, you had a building up of brain activation that predicted when that moment of intent. And he called that the readiness potential. And now with more modern imaging, we can look, using neuroimaging, we can say, okay, choose to go, you press the left or the right button at will, whenever you feel like it. And we can see before they even are consciously aware of making a decision, there's a buildup of brain activation. You can predict with great accuracy whether they're going to go left or right up to 10 seconds before the person is even consciously aware of having the intent. So we know the brain is making these decisions, and our feeling of having agency is coming after the fact, and so in a sense it's an illusion. It's coming after the fact, and the brain is deciding. So some might say, well, the brain, you have unconscious free will, I often say, but really it's the brain is taking all the information based on all your experiences and your present body state, and it's being tipped one way or the other, and how much control we, the conscious I, have over it is not much.
Any other thoughts on the question of free will? Again, kind of a tough one to tackle in a couple minutes.
Yeah,
but
it's a huge discussion, of course. I tend to be in a compatibilist point of view, where I don't see any contradiction between that kind of determinism within the brain and a notion of free will. One way to look at it is, what are you? You have to understand what your self is. Your self is constructed by those very neuroscientific processes. So you could well have a sense of free will at the level of you, even if it's determined by basic biochemical or even more deeply physical processes. So the world can be completely deterministic, but you can still be free.
I'd rather talk about Free Willy. I think for me, I've done a lot of social science type stuff and positive psychology, so I'm always thinking about bias. And in the AI world, a lot of the work that's being done now is how you can imbue systems with values. And that's, you'll see a lot of things in machine learning where they'll have a machine watch 10,000 hours of video. So there's a famous AI guy named Stuart Russell. He's the co-author of the world's most popular AI textbook. And he gives this great example that I think relates here, which is, he says, if you're going to create a kitchen robot, like a Cuisinart robot or Roomba or whatever, and it can make 10,000 meals, he says, don't forget to tell it to not cook the cat. Which I love that, because this to me, again, I was very intrigued by what Heather said, because that's not my expertise. I think it's fascinating. But there's also the sense of robots, as we're training them, we don't think about the fact that since age one, day one, and by the way, Sherry Turkle's book talks a lot about empathy in infants and stuff. It's fascinating. We are immersed in things that train, I would assume, maybe deep parts of our brain, or if not, parts of our experience, this is where I'm guessing, that affect so deeply who we are. And of course, our circumstances and Maslow and all that, although again, I would totally get that, because I've read those tests, they're fascinating. You click this button versus that. That to me seems somewhat preternatural. Maybe it refers back to I'm being hunted by a mammoth, so free will is also about survival. But then I guess I would go back to what you said in the sense of free will, especially in terms of faith, who you fall in love with, all that type of stuff. There's some inevitability, of course, but at some point, I think if you don't have free will, then it's also like Matrix, and why the fuck keep going on, and back to Free Willy.
But just to add, I think the just touching upon the moral, ethical kind of things. So some people say okay, well, if I don't have free will, then I can do whatever I want because it's not, me. But that doesn't mean that we don't have responsibility for our actions. So when I talked about free will, it was that very specific sense of, okay, the brain is deciding 300 milliseconds before you're consciously aware of it. But we have, as humans, we've evolved to have the capacity to have self-control. So in a healthy, fully functioning brain. So you have these innate impulses, whether it be okay, I want to rape that girl or whatever it is, and then you have this prefrontal cortex that says, wait, you know what? Maybe that's not such a good idea based on society and the rules and the values that I've internalized that your brain has learned, and you weigh these things. But if you have a lesion to the prefrontal cortex or underactivation or not a fully developed one, it's not fully developed until about the age of 25, you have less of a capacity for self-control, and therefore we have sentencing is different for people who don't have the capacity to have self-control. So even though we might not have free will in that classical Cartesian sense, doesn't mean that we aren't responsible for our actions and making the right kinds of these moral decisions.
Great.
I'm actually not responsible for my actions. I have a special license.
So I think we have time for maybe up to 3 more questions before we have to wrap it up. So yes, over here.
Do you think it's possible we're all in an emulation right now?
Question is it possible that we're all in an emulation? What do you guys think?
There's beer, so I'm pretty happy if that's the case.
This comes up a lot, obviously, in cosmology, actually. We have a whole Boltzmann brain problem that has to deal with this very question. It seems quite likely we would be in an emulation if emulations were possible. But my argument would be it actually kind of doesn't matter. We still have to explain the structure of our perceived reality, which to us is reality. So there may well be matrix levels above our head, or maybe ones below us even, but we still have to explain ours.
Yeah. I have nothing to say.
Okay, yes, here.
So I've got 2 questions, both in the woo-woo category of consciousness. So could perspectives on whether plants or fungi might have something that we might call consciousness, or that things on another level, the entire Earth. These are popular woo-woo consciousness questions, but I've heard more in the first category, or on plants and fungi, that might be a little more legitimate. So I'm just curious. Maybe it sounds like other might not.
So the question is, can we ever think of plants or fungi as being conscious? And we might also think of potentially the whole universe, some super consciousness as well.
I think ultimately to answer these questions, you need a a theory of consciousness, which can measure it. Like, does this, plant have it? Does this, does the internet have it? Does this computer have it? And as the theory of integrated information, where this would predict that it is a property of the universe, so you can basically measure it then in any kind of system. And so ultimately, and Dave Chalmers talked about this a while back, like even a light switch has, it's either on or off. We'd call it like a bit of information. So it would have a bit of what we call phi, or consciousness. Now that type of consciousness doesn't mean anything. That's not the type of consciousness I'm trying to explain. But like Tononi and Koch would say, it is a panpsychic view, that an integrated theory of consciousness, in that any system that has some degree of this sort of integrate some type of information, that will have some degree of phi, of consciousness. So in that sense, yeah, an algae could have it and a plant could have it, but what does that really mean? It doesn't mean much to me in terms of, I'm mostly, interested in this type of consciousness that I'm experiencing. And whether the universe can have it, well, the spaces are so far between the matter itself that it can't have any meaningful interaction between, that I said, that causal information. So likely not.
Except for spooky action and a distance.
Right.
Yeah, well, that probably won't be related to entanglement in that particular sense. So, I mean, you can apply Tononi's the integrated information theory to that very question and assign a degree of consciousness actually to the United States, to Gaia, to dark energy, presumably even any of these kinds of systems. So that's one way to kind of go at the problem. The other way, I think, is what you were also alluding to. We kind of start with what we do know, or what we think we know, namely, I'm conscious, George is conscious, and I kind of radiate out, well, you look somewhat like me, therefore you're probably conscious too, and we go a little bit further. A plant looks a little bit less like me, but actually biochemically it's almost the same, so probably there's some degree of consciousness there. And then we go to AI systems, and we can also kind of take that kind of concentric circle view of it.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. I think there's one in the way back. Is that a hand back there? Yeah.
So I know we can see distinctive personalities between people, but I was wondering if there's been any measure between like levels of consciousness, or if there's any kind of like difference in consciousness that you can see from person to person that might correlate with how they behave or anything like that.
So the question is, are there different levels of consciousness from person to person that would explain how they behave?
I wouldn't call. What do you say?
Like the election?
Oh. I wouldn't call them levels of consciousness. I'm very hesitant to say that. I would say there are different types of consciousness, or different types of conscious experience. So some people talk about, our consciousness is going to evolve into a higher state of consciousness. That's not really it. It's a different state of consciousness. So when you're taking, let's say, a psychedelic, you're going to be in a different state of consciousness. It's not a higher level. So just like, this well-known philosopher Thomas Nagel said, I'll never know what it's like to be a bat. A bat is going to have, it navigates the world with sonar. It's going to experience the world and have a consciousness. It's different type than what I'm going to have experience. I'll never know what that feels like. All I can know is my first-person subjective experience. Now, brains are all different. There's no normal brain. So everybody is experiencing the world in slightly different ways, having different types of consciousness. People have personality disorders. Their brains are functioning slightly different. But it's all awareness. It's all the same. It's all consciousness. They're just different types of experiences.
I was just going to add, hopefully this answers your question, but I'm a big studier of emotional intelligence. And also as an actor, I was telling a story like this before, you start off as an actor thinking you're impersonating. That's what you think you're going to do, and you go out on a stage like this, and you're like, I'm going to be funny tonight. And you do a Neil Simon play, and you're like, this line's funny, and you highlight it, and you circle it, they're going to laugh. And you go out and you try to make people laugh, and typically that's death, because that's not your job. As an actor, you're supposed to be up there and say the line, and the character typically doesn't think it's funny. Like, it's tragedy for them. That's what makes it howlingly funny for you. And the thing about emotional intelligence as an actor, I did some stand-up years ago, and like I said, as a writer, there's like different levels of consciousness where you become really conscious of different people, and this is how now I'm going to your question. I think there's inherent emotional intelligence, and then there's also, you got to practice. I think this is where a lot of people don't get that the subjective side of you can still do things. Like positive psychology is, You can make a list of what you're grateful for. And the guy who kind of created the science, Martin Seligman, has done all these tests, where he did tests with a couple of hundred different patients suffering from extreme depression, like clinical depression, in a hospital for depression. And the only thing that changed every day with their care, he said, write down 3 things you're grateful for. So I had applesauce today. The nurse smiled at me, whatever it was. The point was that action that they took of saying, I'm grateful, they did measurements and MRIs and all that types of stuff and diminishing the stress and all that things. And so there's hard metrics of the change of these aspects of our subjective, what is often called our subjective reality. Just we haven't validated it yet. Society is like, well, that's bullshit, just being grateful. Yeah, thanks, Oprah, fuck you. You know, but the point is when you do it and you start to practice it, and then you also see in my work, I like seeing things like, well, in America, the biggest cost center typically for the medical side of things is emergency rooms because in general, most of our medical care is crap. So we're spending all this money on drugs and all that stuff, and if it works for a person, great. But if we can start to have people like practice gratitude in one core community, and you think, well, that's just total bullshit, and then you have them do it, and you start to see how it decreases stress, etc. It's a very hard thing for me because you tell people like that, and they're like, that sounds really crunchy granola. I'm like, look, if you want to call what, not you guys, but if you want to call what you do empirical and what I do bullshit, you know, I was raised, my dad was a psychiatrist. I still remember there being this, in the 70s, this real fear of shrinks. Really quick story. I was like 4 or something, 5, and I kept kicking the screen door to my house. I was like, you know, just kept kicking it. And we just moved to this new house. And the neighbors were walking around, and my dad was gardening in the front yard. And so my dad was like, John, please stop kicking the fence, the door. And again, he's a psychiatrist. Everyone knew he was a psychiatrist. No one to talk to us for weeks. No one came to our house. And then I kept kicking the door, and he's like, you need to stop kicking the door. And I was like, you know, I was 4, so of course I keep kicking the door. Now in my memory, I picture like people mowing their lawns, like looking, what's the shrink gonna do? And eventually he said, John, I'm gonna have to spank you, because it was the 70s and you spanked. And he said, I'm gonna have to spank you if you do that again. And I was waited, and then I hit the door, and he came over and he spanked me. And we got people within the next couple hours brought us pies. And that's the type of thing where it's like, I'm cool with the fact that it's tough. This work about emotional intelligence is hard. And I grew up in the 80s where the Reagan era and all that stuff, guys have to be tough, and it's total bullshit, you know, in the sense of like, I'm a dad. Introspection, honoring the side of yourself that's subjective. This is my final point. Emotional intelligence, the consciousness of others. That's how I want to live my life, is being conscious of you, and hopefully when we interact, you leave where you hopefully feel better. Otherwise, you know, I might be having a bad day, you too, but why else do it?
Great. Well, I want to thank all 3 of our panelists, John, George, and Heather. Thank you guys so much for doing this. Thank you guys all for coming. I think our panelists will be around at least for a few minutes afterwards. If you guys have questions, feel free to corral them at the bar and buy them a drink and chat. We don't have our next date planned yet, but like I said earlier, if you want to go to one of our, well, it's not up there right now, if you want to go to empiricistleague.com or our Facebook page or our Twitter handle, you can learn about future events. Thank you guys again so much for coming out, and there's Karen back there. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye.